We are now going to shift our focus towards East Asia, and we'll start with Korea. Now remember, Korea was going to be annexed by Japan in 1910. So in 1910, Japan will formally take over Korea. Korea will become a part of the Japanese Empire. Koreans resist this through violent and nonviolent means, but ultimately they are defeated. So Koreans are not particularly happy about being part of the Japanese Empire, but they're not able to kick out Japan. Their country's taken over. They become part of the empire. And Japan will put serious restrictions on freedom of speech and assembly. So to give an example, once Japan annexes Korea, there will be no more independent newspapers. Before the annexation, Korea had several newspapers printed by Koreans. They may face censorship at times, but they were independent newspapers nonetheless. But after annexation in 1910, Japan will get rid of all those independent newspapers, and the only Korean newspaper will be the one published by the colonial government. And Japan will also put serious restrictions on freedom of speech and assembly as well. So it's very difficult for the Koreans to talk about political issues. And you'll notice this is very different from Britain and India. Britain did allow a decent amount of freedom, even when it at times attempted to restrict it. So Japan is going to be pretty good at restricting freedom of speech and assembly among Koreans, with one exception, and that's religion. Because Japan is an ally with Great Britain, because it's very concerned about American opinions, it has to be very careful with how it treats religion in Korea, because most of the Protestant missionaries in Korea are American or British. So in order to maintain a good relationship with the United States and Britain, Japan has to allow some religious freedom. If they don't, the missionaries will complain, Japan will look bad, and that could hurt their relationship with the United States and Great Britain. So Koreans are going to get together in their religious organization naturally and talk politics. And one thing, remember, I tried to emphasize that Christianity, and pretty much any religion, but in this context, particularly Christianity, is not simply a set of ideas, a set of doctrines about what you believe about Jesus. There's also this understanding and this belief that Christianity leads to democracy and other things that will make you have a modern, powerful nation state. So religion and politics go together very closely. So the fact that Japan is not able to restrict religion like they would like to gives Koreans a space to talk about politics. And one thing they're going to talk about is Woodrow Wilson's call for national self-determination. Many Koreans are very excited about this idea of national self-determination. They love the idea that all they have to do is just say that they want their own independent nation, state, and they'll be given it. All they have to do is say, we Koreans we're a nation, the Korean nation, we want our own state, and so we get it. So what will happen is, using the cover of religion, Christians and other religious groups will get together and launch an independence movement. Basically what they do is they create a Declaration of Independence. 33 leaders will sign it. And what I think is fascinating is that there was only a tiny minority of Koreans who actually belonged to a religion. They had religious beliefs, they just didn't belong to organizations. But of the 33 signers, I believe 11 were Protestant Christian, 10 were members of a new religious group called Chondogyo, which means Religion of the Heavenly Way, and then 2 more were Buddhist monks. So the key thing here, you can see the power of religion here, even though most Koreans did not belong to a religious organization, because religions allowed people to talk about politics and to organize and gave people access to political ideas, it's going to be religious organizations, particularly Protestant Christians, who are going to organize this. And it's a peaceful demonstration, right? They get together, these 33 people, most of them get together, some of them are away, but a large number of them assemble, read out the Declaration of Independence, and then coinciding with this, a large number of Korean students will start handing out copies of the Declaration of Independence as well as Korean flags, and Koreans then will run around shouting, Korean independence for 10,000 years. And about 1 million people are going to participate in this movement. It's huge, especially because we consider Korea just had a population of like 20, 25 million or so, and 1 million people are going to participate. The Japanese government is completely caught off guard by this and is really surprised. They thought that they kind of controlled everything in Korea, and then all of a sudden the Koreans are doing this, and they react by just machine gunning people, shooting people, chopping people down with swords. And it's really, really striking the amount of power they use to put down this movement. But in this case, this just only leads to the growth of nationalism, right? Even though the March 1st movement is put down, Koreans are really going to emphasize that they should be independent, because look at how these Japanese act, right? All we did was ask for independence peacefully, and they responded with this kind of violence, right? Unfortunately, the Koreans didn't realize that national self-determination was only for the losers, not for the winners, right? Japan was on the winning side of the war, so they get to keep their colonies. Koreans had hoped that this would apply to them. In the end, it didn't. Now, I want to focus on a particular individual who participated in the March 1st movement, a woman named Yu Kwan-soon. And if you were to go to Korea and ask someone who Yu Kwan-soon was, they would all know who she is. She's a very, very famous woman in Korea. And I like to use her because she shows us, I think, about the kind of transformations that are happening during this time period. So first of all, Yu Kwan-soon was from the provinces. She was from not from Seoul, not from the political capital of Korea. She was out in the provinces. She lived in a farming village. And so she's not the kind of person who would have been active in politics because A, she was from the countryside, and B, she was a woman. However, her family is going to be one of the first people in Korea to convert to Methodist Christianity. Her family will become Methodists, and they become a kind of leaders in the local Methodist church. Their village is so small that it doesn't always have a foreign missionary there. And when the foreign missionary is gone, her family will take care of the church and help conduct services and so forth. And this plugs her into a kind of missionary network. And a woman, female missionary named Miss Alice Sharp, will notice that Yu Kwan-soon herself is pretty sharp. See what I did there? That's not going to be the only pun I'm going to tell. There's another one coming up. But Miss Sharp sees that Yu Kwan-soon is very smart and arranges for her to go to Seoul, the capital, to receive a modern education. And one thing we have to stress here is she's going to be taught a lot by American missionaries. And even though American missionaries don't really support like resistance to the government, they teach American history. What happens in American history? Americans start off as colonies that fight and obtain their independence and then become a powerful independent nation state. If you're a Korean, that sounds pretty cool, right? You're a member of a country that has become a colony, and you would certainly like to become independent and form a powerful independent nation state. So even as missionaries, even though they're not trying to encourage Koreans to rebel, to resist Japanese colonial rule, they're doing it inadvertently. And so she will be inspired by these ideas to participate in the independence movement, right? She's going to participate in the March 1st independence movement. And she will actually help organize it. She will be a leader. So this is amazing, right? This young lady is going to help lead a political movement. That 20 years before this, that did not happen in Korea. Girls from the provinces, especially one that's only like 18 years old, do not become political leaders. But here, that's exactly what she's doing. Now, unfortunately, she will be arrested by the Japanese and will be beaten and tortured in prison and will eventually die from that poor treatment. And that picture you see right there, that's basically her mugshot. That's the picture they took of her when she was taken to prison. So we can kind of see the tragedy that happens to people that are locked in these colonial systems, right? She is going to have a kind of transformation, and she signifies a kind of transformation, right? Women are going to have new opportunities. Like I said, provincial girls traditionally in Korea did not get an education, certainly not a modern one, and they were not active in politics. But she will become active in politics and receive a modern education. However, there's a tragedy here because she will die living them out, right? She will die living them out. And so, Yu Kwan-soon is lost in this way. It's very sad. And I really miss Yu Kwan-soon. I really miss you. That was the second one. It was really bad, but I do need to bring in some levity because this is a little bit depressing what happens to this poor woman. But I do really miss her. She's great. She's awesome. Now, the situation with Japan is rather complex, and I have to do in a very short time what I spend hours doing in my History of Japan class. But we have to understand that there's going to be a transformation, that Japan is going to shift from being on the side of the Allies, in a sense, during World War I, to the side of Nazi Germany in World War II. Right? It's kind of striking. Japan fought alongside the United States, Britain, and France in World War I, but against the United States, Britain, and France in World War II. And that's kind of shocking, and we're going to start in this section to try and understand a little bit about why that happened. But first of all, we have to emphasize that things in many ways were going well in the 1920s for Japan at first. Japan had enjoyed an economic boom during World War I. Remember how I talked about how the United States becomes richer through World War I? We don't lose nearly as many people as the Europeans do, and we make money selling stuff to the Europeans. That's exactly what happens to Japan. Japan will not lose nearly as many people in the war as the Europeans do, and it will make a lot of money selling stuff to Europeans who are busy fighting each other. So Japan, though there will be some setbacks, will be becoming wealthier during the 1920s in some important ways. And there's also going to be a growth in Japan of democracy. Japan will face some conflicts. We don't really have time to go into them in this section in the 1920s, but they do face some conflicts. And the response of the Japanese government is to have more democracy, not less. So Japan in 1925 will allow universal manhood suffrage. All men will get the right to vote. So that's significant. Japan is becoming more democratic, not less. And kind of running in parallel to this, there's going to be an embrace of Western culture. Many Japanese people will see the West as something to be imitated, not as an enemy, but as something good that should be imitated. And right there on the right is a picture. It's a cosmetics advertisement, particularly it's advertising soap. And that is a Japanese woman as the model. But you can see a couple things about her. First of all, she almost looks like a Westerner, right? If I didn't tell you she was Japanese, you would maybe think she was Caucasian, right? It's kind of hard to tell. And so there's this sense where you're imitating the West. And in particular, I want to point out she's wearing a perm. She has a permanent wave. And that was considered a modern hairdo. And you may think that's kind of funny as a way of saying that Japan is looking to the West as a model. But I should point out during World War II, the Japanese government actually tried to ban the perm. They also tried to ban baseball. They failed at both. However, there's going to be a change, particularly after the Great Depression. Japan is not a self-sufficient country. The Japanese, for example, could not grow enough food to feed their people. They were dependent on imports of food to survive. And they were also dependent, for example, on importing oil in order to run their economy. So Japan was hit very hard by the Great Depression, especially how international trade fell apart. So that's kind of the first problem that Japan faces, is that international trade falls apart after the Depression, and they were highly dependent on international trade, not simply to make money, but to get food. And, think about this from the American perspective. Even if we have terrible economy, we have a bunch of land, we can grow food, we can live. Japan faces a possibility of starvation because they don't grow enough food. The other big problem was that their liberal democracy, for reasons we won't go into here, is unable to solve Japan's problems. Right? Nothing succeeds like success. If liberal democracy works, people will follow it. If it doesn't seem to work, people will try something else. And so facing these extraordinarily difficult economic problems, Japan's liberal democracy is unable to deal with them. Japan's liberal democracy is unable to solve them. And so Japan is going to shift away from the West towards trying to develop its own path to modernity, right? Away from capitalist liberal democracy towards something else. So if international trade isn't working, Japan needs to focus on self-sufficiency. They need to figure out a way to make their empire self-sufficient. Now, in this time period, right, Japan controls some islands, it controls Taiwan, it controls Korea. That's not enough to be self-sufficient. So Japan says, we need to expand to obtain resources that we're not able to get as easily now because of the decline of international trade. And some of these are strategic resources. We need to make sure that we have them ourselves. So Japan says we need to expand to obtain resources that are difficult to trade for. In addition, they are afraid of growing Chinese unity. We'll talk about China momentarily, but China Remember when we last left China, China was divided and was in a civil war. Well, China is becoming unified. And Japan is afraid that if China becomes unified, it will want it to keep its resources. Japan wants to get resources from China, but if China becomes unified and powerful, it will keep those resources. And instead of being supplying those resources to Japan, will become a competitor with Japan. In addition, Japan is also frightened of the Soviet Union, does not like communism. Just to make it clear, right? Japanese in this time period believe that their emperor was a living god, but communism teaches that there is no god, right? That's kind of superstitious. So you can guess that the Japanese government did not like communism, and it was considered a major threat to Japan. In addition, we have to emphasize that, remember, Japan had fought Russia in the Russo-Japanese War and had won, but just barely. And the Japanese were always afraid of a Russian war of revenge. And Russia has essentially become the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union is becoming more powerful. So the Japanese feel surrounded. They feel under pressure. They're having trouble getting the resources they think they need on an international market, so they think they have to expand. Right? They feel threatened by China and by Soviet communism. And increasingly people will turn to the military and to the emperor for help away from liberal democracy. So Japan will become increasingly ruled by the military in the name of the emperor. Right? Japan will increasingly be governed by the military in the name of the emperor. And so what that means then is they are going to choose a violent way of trying to obtain self-sufficiency, of getting access to resources. For example, in 1931, Japan will seize control over Manchuria through military means. If you look at Korea, just north of Korea is a region of Manchuria, which is today a part of China and then was also, of course, a part of China. They will take that over. Then between the years 1932 and 1936, Japan will expand its influence in China, gain more and more power over Chinese territory. They will do this mostly peacefully because the Chinese government doesn't think that it can resist Japan effectively. But by 1937, Japan has expanded so much that the Chinese government has no choice but to resist. And so Japan will then launch a full-scale invasion. So essentially, because of the Great Depression and because of this need to gain resources, because of the rise of the power of the military who's going to increasingly govern the name of the emperor, Japan is going to seek territorial expansion in order to get the resources it needs from China so it can resist, so it can keep China weak, so it can get those resources, and so it will be able to be strong enough to defeat Soviet communism because it thinks that there's going to be a war against them soon. So you may recall when we were last talking about China, things were not going well in China. China was in chaos. There was no effective central government after the fall of the Qing Empire. There were governments that claimed to be the central government, but they didn't really actually govern China. Right? China had been divided, had fallen apart. And you can kind of see this depicted in this picture on the right. This is a comic in which a Chinese person is being strangled by two people, right? And that Chinese person represents the Chinese people. The person on the right represents Chinese warlords. China had divided up, even though they had a official central government, it really didn't govern China. Instead, most of China was governed by generals who used their armies to control territory, and they governed that territory. So China is divided, it's chaotic. It has a government that claims to be the central government, but doesn't really exercise any real authority. In addition, on the left of the two people strangling the poor Chinese man, that represents foreign imperialism and capitalism, right? Because China is weak, Japan and Western countries are able to kind of come in and do what they want in China, right? They're able to expand their power into China. Right? There's no effective government that can stop them. In fact, a lot of times the central government will, in order to get money to support itself, because it can't really collect taxes, because it's ineffective, is going to give over Chinese territory to the Japanese or to Western powers, right? Give them control over Chinese territory. So as the power of Japan in the West strengthens in China, more and more Chinese people feel it. More and more Chinese people experience that. And as they face oppression because they're Chinese, that kind of regionalism I talk about will increasingly disappear. Remember, we talked about how Chinese, during the Sino-Japanese War, during the Opium War as well, were often divided by region. They didn't really feel a strong Chinese identity so much as a regional identity. This is especially true among the lower classes. But in this time period, this oppression by Western and Japanese imperialism and the weakness caused by China being divided will lead more and more Chinese to become nationalistic and say, we need to unite. We need to unite and form China into a powerful nation state, because if we don't, Western countries and Japan are going to continue to bully us. So we need to overthrow the warlords and unite. So you have that increasing sense of nationalism among Chinese people being brought about by this kind of bad treatment by the Japanese and Western powers. Now, what's really complicated about World War I, and we talked about this previously, is that China and Japan are both on the side of the Allies during World War I. Right? Japan had helped to drive the Germans out of Qingdao, and what's complicated about that was that was Chinese territory that the Germans had pressured the Chinese into giving them control over. Now Japan is going to have control over it. China, you'll remember, had sent laborers to help dig trenches and do other work, which freed up the British and the French and others to actually do the fighting. So both China and Japan expected to be rewarded when the Versailles Treaty was signed. Japan expected to be able to be given the Qingdao territory. China expected that the territory would be returned to it. Right? You had this complex situation where you had the Japanese had seized Chinese territory that had been under German control. And the basic question is, does it go back to China, which is what China thought, or does Japan get to keep it, which is what Japan wanted to do? In the end, Japan gets to keep the territory. Now, it's very complex why this happened. Basically, the Chinese central government had agreed to let Japan have it secretly in exchange for money. So technically, what Japan was doing was legal, but nevertheless, Chinese people felt betrayed. Right? They had helped, and they felt like they had been in the war, and they felt like they had been stabbed in the back. And how can we say that it is right and just that you can just give away parts of our country? Right? This government isn't really our government. It claims to be the central government, but it's not. So Chinese people are going to feel really betrayed by this. Right? They're going to be angry at Japan. They're going to be angry at a lot of the capitalist liberal democracies. How could you do this to us? We helped you. Why would you not give back our territory? But most of all, they're critical of themselves. Right? Chinese people look at this and say, how could we betray ourselves? How could we be so weak? How could a Chinese government give away Chinese territory? What is wrong with us? We need to fix this. We need to fix China because we're tired of getting beaten up all the time. And this will help lend strength to the Nationalist Party. Right? Sun Yat-sen's ideas will be very attractive in the aftermath of this this anger in China, the sense of betrayal, and the sense that China needs to undergo some thoroughgoing reforms in order to become a powerful country that people can't beat up on. Now, Sun Yat-sen, unfortunately, will basically he contracts stomach cancer and dies. That's a terrible way to die. Poor son. I feel bad for the guy. He will die in 1925. And leadership of the Nationalist Party will pass then to Chiang Kai-shek. And in American publications at this time, he's often referred to as Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. And you can see why looking at the picture on the right. He was, first and foremost, a military man. He was a general. And he will become the leader of China for a couple of decades. And we'll talk more about this later. But he is the leader of the Nationalist Party, has been building up an army that is united around Sun Yat-sen's three principles of the people. Remember, democracy, nationalism, and people's livelihood. He's got this ideologically driven army that wants to make a new China, a powerful China, and they will together launch what's called the Great Northern Expedition. It's called that because Chiang Kai-shek was based in southern China, so his army will march north and unite much of the country under Nationalist Party rule, even though his army's not that big, because they're fired by this kind of nationalist ideology. They really believe in their cause. They fight really strongly. They fight very bravely, and they easily defeat many of the warlords. And this allows him to unite much of the country under Nationalist Party rule. Now, in many ways, Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Party, I think, is similar to Lazaro Cardenas and the Industrial Revolutionary Party. In a sense, China looks like it's kind of on a similar path to Mexico. However, there are two problems, right? And two reasons why they're not going to go on that exact same path. First, as we mentioned earlier, when Japan is trying to, or when China rather, is trying to develop, Japan will invade, right? So China was on its way under Chiang Kai-shek of developing of its economy, of building up stability, and it gets invaded by Japan. So it'd be kind of like as if poor Mexico was trying to get through all of its troubles, and then the United States invades. And a very serious, long-lasting invasion to boot. In addition, Chiang Kai-shek will also have to face a civil war. Chiang will be fighting the communists. There is a group of people, not as many as the nationalists, and they're not in control, but who would like not to have the Nationalist Party rule, but who thinks the Communist Party should rule, who thinks that China should become communist. Right? Chiang Kai-shek is kind of developing his own path towards modernity, similar to Mexico, which is kind of socialist, kind of capitalist, somewhat democratic. However, there are other Chinese people who believe that they should follow communism, and this will lead to a civil war. So Chiang Kai-shek is in a very difficult situation. He's essentially having to fight a foreign invasion and a civil war. These will go on. At first, he's fighting a civil war, then the Japanese invade, and then they sometimes fight the civil war, and they sometimes don't. It gets very complex. But Chiang faces two big problems: Japanese invasion, Chinese civil war. That makes it much harder for him to follow the same path that Mexico's doing in building an economically powerful China and an independent China as well.